welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is 3 tips for Commander deck building. So I already made a video about my rules for deck building in Commander, but of course there's a lot more than 5 rules. There's a whole bunch of things that I sort of look at when I'm building a Commander deck. Just little nuances that can make a big difference when building your Commander deck. I also did my 3 mistakes when building a Commander deck, things that you should probably avoid. These are 3 things that you can do, little changes that you can make that can make a big difference in the performance of your deck. This is the kind of stuff I talk about a lot on my Deck Doctor videos on my Patreon. I do Deck Doctor videos every week on my Patreon where I take my patrons' decks and I go over things like this, making these slight changes that can make a big difference in your deck. If you're interested, my Patreon link is in the description below. Feel free to join up. But let's get started here. First of all, let's talk about permanent types. And there's actually a few different things to cover in this specific topic. And there will be some overlap here a little bit, but let's start with playing permanents over playing spells. Now, obviously, if you are in a spell slinger theme, which I will get more to, you're going to want more of spells. And I guess spells refers to, I guess everything is essentially a spell really, except for lands, but spells, I typically use that word to describe instants and sorceries, whereas a permanent is something that's obviously going to stick on the battlefield for a while. I tend to like the permanents over the spells when I'm looking for specific things for my deck. I just talked about this with Village Rites, and Vampiric Rites is a card that I would prefer because Village Rites is only a one-shot, whereas Vampiric Rites will stick on the battlefield and I get to use it over and over and over again. That's my preference there. Sometimes the instant speed one-shot can be better, yes, but for me, because we have the singleton format and 99 cards in our deck, I want something that's going to stick on the battlefield and I get to reuse it over and over and over again. This especially is the case when it comes to card draw. I would prefer something on the battlefield that's going to be drawing me cards over and over and over again rather than a one-shot that I only get to draw a couple of cards with. Another thing you might want to look at when you're putting those permanents in your deck is that enchantments and artifacts can very often be better than creatures, and the reason why is because people just tend to put a lot more creature removal in their deck, right? If you have a specific card that you want to be putting in your deck that's doing a certain thing that fits with the strategy of what you're doing, obviously, doing it in enchantment or artifact form might be better than doing it in creature form because creature board wipes are very common in the format, and it's likely that you will just lose that creature incidentally because your opponent is just casting a board wipe anyway, whereas the enchantment or the artifact will end up sticking around. Enchantment and artifact board wipes are a lot less common, even targeted removal, right? Swords to Plowshares is the most common removal spell in the entire format, so it's a lot more likely that your opponent is going to have targeted creature removal in their deck rather than targeted enchantment and artifact removal, although you should certainly have both in your deck, I think. I don't think enchantment and artifact removal gets played nearly enough in the format, and for that reason, you can take advantage of it by putting enchantment and artifacts that are doing that same thing rather than putting a creature form in the deck. The same goes for your ramp, right? I don't love mana dorks in the format. I almost never put them in my decks unless there's a specific reason to do so. Obviously, if you want mana dorks in your deck because you're doing a mana dork tribal or maybe you're doing an elf ball deck, of course, it's going to be good there. I will get more to that. Again, there's a lot of overlap here. Mana dorks obviously are really easy to kill in this format, so a mana rock is probably better, right? A mana dork is going to die to that creature removal or those board wipes. A mana rock isn't going to die to those, so they'll probably stick around on the battlefield a lot longer. So unless you specifically want lots of creatures in your deck or mana dorks in your deck, mana rock is probably the better option. But an even better option is land ramp, or those spells that you cast to go get lands and put them directly into play, or I guess the creatures that can go put lands directly into play as well. As we all know, land destruction is really uncommon in the casual Commander format, so you're not going to be seeing it that much, whereas artifact, enchantment, creature removal, a lot more common. It is almost assured that if I cast a Rampant Growth or maybe a 3 visits on turn 2, I am going to go get a land, put it into play, and it is probably going to stick there for the entirety of the game. That's almost a guarantee. If I play a mana dork or a mana rock, that might not be the case, right? Of course, green is going to be the color that's going to be doing this the most. You're not necessarily going to be doing this with every color combination, but I want the stuff that is putting lands directly into play if I'm looking at ramp, because it's likely once I do so, that land's going to be there forever. Obviously, white is pretty good at the land ramp as well, but there also is a lot of great colorless options for putting lands directly into play. That is my preference. If I'm looking for ramp in my deck, I want the stuff that's going to stick there for the entire game, and I don't have to ever worry about it getting removed. All right, let's move on to the next one, which is use the card that fits the strategy of what you're doing. And this might seem obvious, but I find people don't nearly do it enough as they probably could, because the card that fits the strategy of what you're doing isn't always going to be the best option. However, as you're playing your deck, you might find that it is better than you originally think because it is fitting the strategy of what you're doing, right? So again, getting back to the Mana Dork Mana Rock thing, I want to play Mana Rocks more in a deck where maybe I want artifacts, right? If I want lots of artifacts in play, I'm playing an artifact theme. Obviously, my ramp is going to be in artifact form. If I want lots of creatures in play, it'll probably be in creature form. Maybe I'm playing an enchantment tribal deck, so now I want to play my ramp in enchantment form. And yes, you can do that, right? You play those wild growths and those utopia sprawls in your enchantment theme deck as your ramp option. So when you're doing your card draw, your removal, your ramp, those are the three big ones. I'm going to choose the things that are synergizing with what I'm doing in my deck. I just talked about this in a Deck Doctor video I did recently. My patron had a Denry Klin deck and they were doing the really interesting janky strategy, playing those Myojins, putting an indestructible counter on your commander that you can then put on your Myojin when you cheat it into play because it's going to get the counters that your commander has on it. Really interesting strategy. And what I said to them is, yes, you're doing a very janky strategy here. You're doing something very specific, but at the end of the day, you are playing a creature heavy deck, right? Your commander is putting all those counters it has on it on every creature that enters the battlefield. So if I'm building that Denry Klin deck, I want to be doing my card draw, my ramp, and my removal in creature form because I'm going to get the added benefit of getting all those counters as well, right? So if I'm putting a Mana Rock in my deck, it is most certainly going to be an Ornithopter of Paradise. That's probably the best Mana Rock that you can put in a Denry Klin deck. On turn 2, I can play it. It's a pretty good Mana Rock. But on turn 8, I draw that Ornithopter of Paradise off the top of my deck. Now I play it. A Mana Rock on turn 8 is not very good, but it is a creature and it's going to get all the counters that my commander has on it. So it's not just an 0/2 flyer, it's going to get a bunch of counters as well. Might even have an indestructible counter on it. So now I have an indestructible flying creature that can block for an eternity. If I'm doing card draw, an Esper Sentinel seems like a slam dunk in a Denry Klin deck, right? I mean, it's a great card in pretty much every commander deck, extra good in a Denry Klin deck if I'm doing the +1/+1 counter theme, because now my Esper Sentinel enters the battlefield, it gets the counter on it, and my opponents have to pay even more. If I'm doing removal, maybe I want a bounty agent or a Cathar Commando, right? I do my removal in creature form so that I get the added bonus on top of what I already want, right? I'm already getting the removal, but on top of that, when I play that bounty agent, now I'm going to get all those counters that my commander has on it onto my bounty agent, so it becomes a more formidable creature as well. Because later in the game, maybe I don't necessarily need the removal. Now I just need a big scary creature that I can be attacking with. Again, seems pretty obvious, I know, but try to do things in your deck that you have to do anyway, like card draw, removal, and ramp, in the form of what you're doing in your deck. Maybe you're doing an artifact theme, an enchantment theme, a creature heavy deck, or if you're doing, again, a spellslinger theme, now I want to do everything in instant and sorcery form, right? Because I want to be casting instants of sorcery all the time. Now I want my removal to be instants or sorceries, which obviously isn't very difficult to do. The card choices that you make for your deck should fit the strategy of what you're doing, even if they aren't necessarily the best option, right? Rhystic Study is probably better than an Esper Sentinel in any given commander game. However, in that Denry Klin deck, I probably will put an Esper Sentinel in over a Rhystic Study because it is fitting the strategy of what I'm doing. All right, let's move on to the last one, which is Mana Curve. This is something that I don't think gets talked about in Commander nearly enough, and I think it's really, really important. When I'm doing my Deck Doctor videos on my Patreon, one of the first things I look at, because it's very obvious the way I do my Deck Doctor videos, you can very easily see the Mana Curve. Interestingly enough, I had a couple of patrons saying, hey, why don't you use Moxfield for your Deck Doctor videos? A lot of people really like Moxfield. It is great. My first response is, what does the Mana Curve look like? I really want to see the Mana Curve when I'm looking at my deck or anyone else's. I think it's really important when evaluating a deck. Now, what should your Mana Curve be? Well, of course, it should be a nice curve. That's what Mana Curve means. For me, almost every single time I make a deck, again, it does depend a little bit on how your deck actually works, but for me, the 3 mana value is going to be the biggest. almost every single deck I make, I got a decent amount of ones, I got a little bit more twos, threes is going to be the top, and then it is going to come back down the other side. You have to be careful with your mana curve. If you have way too many fives in your deck, for example, which I see a lot on my Deck Doctor videos, you got like 12 or 13 or 14 five drops in your deck, the chances that you have a couple of them in your opening hand are pretty good, and the chances you're going to be sitting in your hand for a while are also pretty good, right? That's why mana curve is important. When I'm building my deck, I want to draw my opening hand. I got a 1 in there, I got a 2, I got a 3, maybe a 4 and a 6. That means my hand curves out nicely as the game progresses, right? On turn 1, I have something that I can play. On turn 2, I have something that I can play, and so on and so forth. You don't want to be stuck with a bunch of high mana value cards in your hand, and you really don't want to be stuck with a lot of low mana value cards in your hand either, I don't think. Unless, of course, your deck is specifically doing that. If I have my opening hand and I got a bunch of 1s and 2s in there, chances are not a lot of them are super impactful. The other downside here, maybe unintended consequence of having that really low mana curve, is you tend to cast things a lot faster. Now, if I'm in a CEDH game, I probably want to be doing that, but just talking about casual Commander here, I don't want to just cast a whole bunch of stuff in the first couple of turns because then I'm empty-handed. It can be a little bit of an upside for you to have a couple of 4 or 5 or 6 mana value cards in your hand, because then you're not encouraged to play them early in the game, like your board wipes, for example, right? This is why I don't mind having a board wipe like an Austere Command or a Farewell that costs 6 mana, because I don't want to cast them early in the game. I want to cast them later in the game. So the mana value of the cards you're putting in your deck also plays into what they're doing, right? I want my targeted removal to be cheap. I want those Swords to Plowshares, those Nature's Claims, so that I can cast them early in the game if my opponent happens to get a really powerful creature out early, or they happen to get a Rhystic Study on the table really quickly. Having cheap targeted removal is really good, but as far as my board wipes go, I don't mind if they are expensive, like 5, 6, or even 7 mana, because I probably want to cast them later in the game because I want to be hitting a whole bunch of stuff with them. I don't want to cast my Farewell and only hit like 2 or 3 creatures. I'd like to hit a whole bunch. I'm getting more card advantage off of it when I do so. So try to look at the mana value of your deck, right? A lot of people, I think, will put Commander decks together without looking at their mana curve at all. A lot of people still put Commander decks together just with their paper cards and maybe don't even look at the mana value ever. I will show you a picture here. This is me and how I do it with my paper decks. I actually set out all the cards in their certain mana values to see what I have in front of me, because I think it is really, really important. So go through your deck, look at the mana curve. It is something that I think a lot of Commander players don't necessarily take into consideration. It can be really, really important. But that is all 3 tips for Commander deck building. Some stuff that maybe a lot of people might not take necessarily into consideration when putting their decks together. Just a few tips from me personally that I do that can end up making a big difference in the performance of your Commander deck. Again, if you're interested in joining my Patreon and having me dissect your deck in my Deck Doctor videos, feel free to do so. I've also posted a Deck Doctor video that I've done before on my channel. If you want to check out exactly how I go about that, feel free to check that out as well. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.